The October sun blazed merciless over the craters of the Moon Wilderness in southern Idaho, transforming the ancient lava fields into a shimmering maze of black rock and heat mirages. 43-year-old park ranger Daniel Voss had ventured into the remote eastern sector that morning to investigate reports of illegal camping near the volcanic vents. By noon, his radio had gone silent. By sunset, his truck sat abandoned at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, engine cold to the touch. The vast expanse of cooled lava stretched for miles in every direction, a landscape so alien it had once trained Apollo astronauts for moon landings. Jagged basalt formations rose like frozen waves, creating endless corridors and dead ends. Beneath the surface, a network of lava tubes snaked through the darkness, some large enough to swallow a house. Daniel had fallen through a hidden skylight while crossing what appeared to be solid ground, plummeting 15 feet into a tubular cavern that would become both his prison and salvation. Before we continue with Daniel's incredible story of survival, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to this channel. Now, let's get back to the wilderness. The fall had shattered Daniel's left ankle and dislocated his shoulder. His radio lay in pieces somewhere above, along with his backpack that had torn free during the descent. He had his uniform, a water bottle half full, a pocket knife, waterproof matches, and the knowledge that nobody would think to search the lava tubes for days. The nearest hiking trail saw visitors maybe twice a week. The sector he'd been investigating was so remote that even experienced backcountry rangers avoided it during summer. That first night, Daniel dragged himself deeper into the tube, following the slight warmth he felt emanating from the rock. His ranger training kicked in despite the pain radiating from his ankle. He knew that the craters of the moon sat atop ancient volcanic activity, and while no eruptions had occurred for 2,000 years, geothermal heat still coursed through the stone labyrinth. He found a chamber where steam vents hissed softly through cracks in the floor, creating a microclimate 20 degrees warmer than the frigid October nights outside. Daniel removed his uniform shirt and hung it near the vents, watching steam curl around the fabric. The heat was gentle but persistent, and he realized these vents could keep him alive. During his 15 years as a ranger, he'd studied the geology of this place obsessively. He knew that morning condensation would collect on the cooler rocks near the entrance, and that certain sections of the tubes remained at temperatures that could prevent hypothermia. What he hadn't studied was how long a human body could survive on drops of condensation and determination alone. The stone around him told stories if you knew how to read them. Flow lines rippled across the ceiling like frozen water, marking where molten rock had rushed through these passages millennia ago. Lava stalactites hung in clusters, and in some places the walls showed a silvery sheen where minerals had leached through over centuries. Daniel had given tours through the accessible tubes countless times, explaining these formations to wide-eyed visitors. Now in the darkness, those lessons became survival tools. He knew which rock formations indicated proximity to the surface, which patterns suggested the tube might narrow or expand ahead. His first priority was stabilizing his injuries. The ankle was the worst. He could see bone fragments moving beneath the swollen skin. Using his belt and 2 straight pieces of volcanic rock he'd broken free, he created a splint, cinching it tight enough to make his vision blur. The shoulder he manipulated back into place himself, bracing against the wall and pulling until something popped sickeningly into position. The pain was so intense, he vomited the small amount of water in his stomach, but afterward he could move his arm enough to function. Meanwhile, above ground, Daniel's wife, Rebecca, had reported him missing when he failed to return home to their ranch outside Arco. Their daughter, 16-year-old Maya, had been the first to notice something wrong when her father didn't show up for her volleyball game. Daniel never missed her games, not in 4 years of high school sports. She'd called his cell phone a dozen times, hearing it ring and ring before going to voicemail. When Rebecca called the ranger station, they confirmed Daniel had checked out a vehicle that morning but hadn't checked back in. Search and rescue coordinator Tom Bradley organized the initial response, deploying teams across the surface trails and known camping areas. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept the black rock fields, but the volcanic stone absorbed and reflected heat in patterns that made distinguishing a human signature nearly impossible. The lava absorbed sunlight all day and radiated it back at night, creating heat signatures everywhere and nowhere. Searchers walked gridded patterns, calling Daniel's name until their voices went hoarse, hearing only wind whistling through the broken landscape. Rebecca knew her husband better than anyone. She'd met him 20 years ago when she was a geology student studying the volcanic formations. Daniel had been a young ranger then, passionate about protecting the wilderness he'd grown up exploring. They'd spent their first date hiking through the lava tubes, Daniel pointing out features with the enthusiasm of someone showing off a beloved home. She'd fallen in love with him there, in the darkness lit by headlamps, listening to him describe the violence and beauty of the Earth's creation. She insisted to Tom that they search the lava tubes, but the network was vast and dangerous. Most tubes hadn't been fully mapped. Some dead-ended after a few feet, others stretched for miles underground. Without knowing which skylight Daniel might have fallen through, searchers could spend months exploring every possibility. Tom explained the math grimly. Over 300 known skylights in the wilderness area, countless more hidden beneath brush and debris. They'd need to rappel into each one, explore the connected passages, and emerge safely before moving to the next. It would take years. The second day, Daniel's water ran out. He'd rationed it carefully, taking only small sips when his throat felt like sandpaper, but the volcanic environment sucked moisture from everything. His lips cracked and bled, leaving copper-tasting streaks on his tongue. He fashioned a crude collection system using his shirt stretched between rocks, positioning it where condensation formed thickest during the cold pre-dawn hours. The temperature differential between the warm steam vents and the cold surface air created moisture that beaded on the stone, then dripped down in irregular patterns. He managed to gather perhaps 2 tablespoons of water, enough to wet his mouth, not enough to sustain him for long. The steam vents that warmed him also dehydrated him, pulling moisture from his skin and lungs with every breath. But without their heat, the nighttime temperatures would kill him faster than thirst. It was a brutal calculation, and Daniel made it consciously. He positioned himself close enough to the vents to avoid hypothermia, but far enough away that he wasn't breathing pure steam. He moved between zones throughout the night, warming when he shivered, cooling when the heat became oppressive. His ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, purple and hot to the touch. Infection was setting in despite his attempts to keep the wound clean with condensation water. He couldn't walk, could barely crawl. He used his belt to create a makeshift splint, cinching it tight despite the agony. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his leg, but staying still meant accepting death. He explored the chamber by dragging himself in circles, mapping its dimensions in his mind. The tube stretched in 2 directions, one toward what he thought was east, where the darkness was absolute, and one toward west, where faint light suggested another opening somewhere distant. Daniel chose east, pulling himself forward 6 inches at a time. His reasoning was simple. If searchers were looking, they'd start at his truck and work outward in the most logical directions. West led back toward the main hiking trails, where they'd concentrate their efforts. East led deeper into the restricted zones, places tourists never went. It was counterintuitive, but he trusted his knowledge of the terrain. He'd spent years studying how the lava had flowed during the last eruptions, creating channels that followed the land's ancient contours. East meant he was moving parallel to the main wilderness boundary, toward a region where veteran rangers sometimes ventured on research trips. The tube widened after 50 yards of agonizing progress. Daniel found another chamber, larger than the first, with multiple steam vents creating a network of warm zones. The ceiling rose 20 feet overhead, and he could hear the wind whistling through cracks somewhere above. Moisture dripped steadily from the ceiling, where temperature differentials were greatest. He positioned himself in the drip zone and opened his mouth, letting drops fall onto his tongue. It tasted of minerals and stone, metallic and slightly sulphurous, but it was water. He spent hours in that position, eyes closed, counting drops. 40 drops to fill his mouth, 300 drops before his stomach felt less hollow. He developed a system: collect water for 2 hours, rest near the vents for 1 hour, drag forward for 30 minutes, repeat. The routine gave structure to time that otherwise had no meaning in the perpetual twilight of the tubes. He marked his rest periods by scratching lines into the volcanic rock with his knife, creating a calendar only he could read. Days 3 and 4 blurred together. Daniel's hunger became a constant companion, gnawing and insistent. He'd learned survival skills during his ranger training, but those lessons assumed access to the surface. Insects to eat, plants to forage, at least the possibility of rescue within 72 hours. The lava tubes were sterile, devoid of life, except for occasional bacteria colonies that glowed faintly in the darkness. He tried scraping them off the walls and eating them, reasoning that any organic matter was better than none. His stomach rejected the attempt violently, leaving him weaker than before. He was burning through his body's reserves, his uniform hanging looser with each passing day. His body began consuming muscle tissue, breaking down the proteins to keep vital organs functioning. He could feel himself weakening, his pulls forward covering less distance, his rest periods growing longer. His mind played tricks, showing him mirages in the darkness. Maya's face, Rebecca's voice calling his name, the smell of coffee brewing in their kitchen. He learned to distinguish reality from hallucination by testing each sensation. If he could touch it, it was real. Everything else was his brain trying to protect him from the isolation. He thought about Maya constantly. She'd been born during a snowstorm, delivered at home when they couldn't make it to the hospital in time. Daniel had cut the umbilical cord with hands that shook with awe and terror. He'd promised her then that he'd always be there, always protect her. The thought of breaking that promise drove him forward when his body begged to stop. He talked to her in the darkness, describing what he saw, keeping his mind sharp by narrating his survival as if she were beside him taking notes for a school project. "The basalt here is rope lava," he whispered to the darkness. "See how it twisted as it cooled. That means it was moving fast, probably during one of the Blue Dragon eruptions 2,000 years ago. The sheen on the walls is mineral leaching, mostly iron and copper compounds. That's what makes the rock look wet even when it's dry." His voice echoed strangely in the chamber, returning to him distorted and unfamiliar. He kept talking anyway, afraid that if he stopped, he'd forget how to form words. Above ground, the search had expanded to involve teams from 3 states. Rebecca had organized a civilian search party, recruiting every rancher, miner, and outdoor enthusiast within 50 miles. They walked shoulder to shoulder across sections of the lava fields, eyes scanning for any sign. A piece of torn fabric, a dropped water bottle, footprints in the patches of soil between rock formations. The volunteers came from as far as Boise, people who'd never met Daniel but understood the code of the wilderness. You searched until you found someone, living or dead. Leaving a person unaccounted for wasn't an option. Maya handed out flyers in Arco, Idaho Falls, and Pocatello, her father's face staring out from hundreds of sheets of paper. The photo showed him in full ranger uniform, smiling beneath his wide-brimmed hat, the volcanic landscape stretching behind him. The local news covered the story, interviewing rangers who called Daniel the most knowledgeable person they'd ever met about the wilderness. If anyone could survive out there, it's him, they said. He knows those lava fields like his own backyard. But as days turned into a week, hope began to fade. The temperatures had dropped into the 20s at night, with frost forming on the black rock by morning. Even with survival training, exposure and dehydration should have killed him by now. The statistics were brutal. Lost hikers rarely survived more than 3 days without water, 5 days maximum in optimal conditions. The lava fields were far from optimal. Tom Bradley prepared Rebecca for the likelihood that they were conducting a recovery operation, not a rescue. He suggested they start focusing on the most likely locations for a body, the places where someone injured might have sought shelter and succumbed. Rebecca refused to accept it. She drove to the wilderness boundary every morning before dawn and spent hours studying topographic maps, tracing her finger along elevation lines that might indicate lava tube locations. She cross-referenced modern geological surveys with historical mining reports from the 1800s, when prospectors had explored the region looking for silver and gold. Some of those old mines had intersected natural lava tubes, creating connections that modern maps didn't show. She became convinced that Daniel had gone deeper underground than anyone was searching, following some instinct or knowledge that only he possessed. Daniel discovered by day 6 that he could move more efficiently by timing his efforts with his body's energy cycles. He dragged himself forward in the cooler morning hours when he felt strongest, then rested near the steam vents during afternoon heat. He'd traveled perhaps 200 yards from his initial fall, though he had no way to measure distance except by counting pulls forward. His hands were shredded, calluses torn open and reformed so many times they barely resembled human skin. His ranger pants had worn through at the knees, the fabric dissolving under constant friction against the abrasive volcanic rock. The 7th night brought a temperature drop that penetrated even the vent's warmth. Daniel huddled against the stone, watching his breath create clouds in the beam of light that filtered down from somewhere above. He'd found another skylight, this one smaller but closer to the surface. He could see stars through the opening, brilliant and cold against the black October sky. He shouted until his voice gave out, hoping someone might be searching above. The only response was silence and the eternal hiss of steam rising from the Earth's hidden heat. He began leaving markers, his ranger badge balanced on a rock formation, his belt stretched across the tube in a deliberate pattern that no natural process could create. If he died here, he wanted whoever found him to know he'd fought intelligently, not just desperately. He wrote messages in the dust using a sharp stone. Day 7, still moving east. Tell Maya I love her. He dated each message carefully, maintaining a sense of time that might otherwise slip away into the darkness and delirium. The act of writing helped him maintain his humanity. Each message was a conversation with the future, a declaration that he still existed as more than just a body struggling to survive. He wrote about what he saw, the geological formations he passed, the way the steam vents pulsed with subtle variations in pressure. He documented his water collection methods and the slow deterioration of his body. If he didn't make it, at least the messages would explain what had happened, would give Rebecca and Maya some closure instead of endless questions. The steam vents became his calendar and his compass. He noticed they pulsed with subtle variations, stronger in what he guessed was morning, weaker at night. The pattern wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent enough to help him track days. He created a ritual around it: wake when the vents strengthened, collect condensation for an hour, exercise his good leg to maintain circulation, drag forward until exhaustion forced rest, sleep near the warmth, repeat. The routine gave structure to time that otherwise had no meaning in the perpetual twilight. By day 9, Daniel's body was consuming itself in earnest. His ribs showed clearly through skin that seemed paper-thin and translucent. His face had hollowed, eyes sinking deep into his skull, cheekbones sharp as the volcanic rock around him, but his mind remained sharp, perhaps sharper than before. Hunger did strange things to consciousness, creating a heightened awareness that made colors brighter and sounds crisper. He noticed patterns in the rock he'd never seen before during his years of guiding tours, flow lines that told stories of ancient eruptions, gas bubbles that revealed the chemical composition of the original magma, mineral deposits that indicated water had once flowed through these passages. He traced the formations with his fingers like reading Braille, letting the stone speak to him about how it had formed. The rock became a book written in a language older than humanity, and Daniel found comfort in reading it. The earth had been here billions of years before him and would remain billions of years after. His survival or death meant nothing to the stone, and somehow that perspective helped. He wasn't fighting against the wilderness. He was simply existing within it, following its rules, adapting to its conditions. He found a chamber where the ceiling soared 20 feet high, creating a cathedral-like space. Light filtered through multiple cracks above, suggesting he'd reached a section where the surface rock had fractured extensively. The chamber floor was relatively flat, covered in a fine volcanic sand that had sifted down through the cracks over centuries. Daniel positioned himself beneath the brightest crack and shouted again, his voice a raspy shadow of its former strength. This time he thought he heard something. A distant sound that might have been a helicopter, or might have been wishful thinking translated into auditory hallucination. He shouted for hours, until his throat bled, and his voice disappeared entirely, until he could only produce a whispered croak that wouldn't carry more than a few feet. Then he lay still, listening to the silence, trying to distinguish between actual sounds and the ringing in his ears from dehydration. The human brain creates noise in silence, phantom sounds that fill the void. Daniel had learned to ignore them, to focus only on what was definitely real. Rebecca, meanwhile, had become obsessed with a section of the wilderness map that showed unusual geological formations intersecting with old mining claims from the 1880s. The area matched where Daniel had been heading, but search teams had already swept it twice from the surface, finding nothing. She convinced Tom to let her join a small team descending into the lava tubes themselves. They'd explored 3 tubes over 2 days, rappelling into darkness and emerging hours later with nothing to show but scraped equipment and disappointed faces. The 4th tube collapsed 50 feet from the entrance, nearly crushing 2 searchers. A section of ceiling that had looked stable gave way without warning, sending tons of rock crashing down. One searcher broke his arm, another suffered a concussion. Tom called off the underground search, deeming it too dangerous. He couldn't justify risking more lives for someone who, statistically, was almost certainly dead. Rebecca argued, pleaded, and finally screamed at him in frustration, but Tom held firm. The underground search was over, but Rebecca couldn't stop. She recruited her brother, an experienced caver named Jack, who'd explored systems throughout the Northwest, the Lewis and Clark caverns in Montana, the Oregon caves, the vast networks beneath Kentucky. Jack brought proper caving equipment, harnesses rated for rescue work, ropes with redundant safety systems, lights that could burn for days on lithium batteries. He studied Rebecca's maps and agreed with her theory about the mining intersection points. If Daniel went deep enough east, Jack said, he might have reached the old prospector tunnels. Some of those connect to natural tubes that were never properly surveyed. They obtained permits and began their own systematic exploration. Maya wanted to come, but Rebecca refused. She couldn't risk losing both her husband and daughter to the stone. Maya stayed home, maintaining the search coordination center they'd set up in their living room, fielding calls from volunteers, updating social media with search information, keeping hope alive even as the official search wound down. Daniel marked day 11 by tearing a strip from his remaining uniform and hanging it like a flag from a rock formation. He'd reached what felt like a nexus point, where multiple tubes intersected in a complex junction. 3 passages led away into darkness, and he had no energy to explore them all. He studied each opening carefully, looking for clues. The leftmost passage was largest, but sloped downward, away from the surface. The center passage was level but narrow. The rightmost passage was smallest, but felt warmest, the air carrying that distinctive mineral smell of active steam vents. He chose the warmest passage, trusting the steam vents to guide him towards sections where the surface was thinner, where heat could rise more easily from the Earth's hidden reservoirs. It was a calculated gamble based on 15 years of geological knowledge. The steam had to come from somewhere, had to follow paths of least resistance through the rock. By following the warmth, he was following the heat's path, and that path might lead to weakness in the surface structure, places where rescuers might more easily penetrate the underground network. The passage narrowed until he was crawling on his stomach, pulling himself forward with his fingernails, pushing with his one good leg. The ceiling pressed down so close he could feel it brushing his back. His dislocated shoulder had healed into a position that allowed limited movement, though the pain never fully subsided. Sharp volcanic glass embedded in the walls cut his arms through his shredded uniform sleeves. He thought about turning back, but the passage behind him seemed to fade into memory, like something that had happened to someone else in a different life. There was only forward, only the next pull, the next breath, the next moment of continued existence. The narrowest section lasted perhaps 20 feet, though it felt like miles. Daniel had to exhale completely to squeeze through, his chest compressed against the stone. For a terrible moment, he thought he was stuck, that he'd wedged himself into a position from which there was no escape. Panic flared bright and hot, making his heart race and his breathing quicken, but training overcame fear. He forced himself to relax, to become smaller, to twist his body at an angle that created a few extra centimeters of clearance. Then he was through, emerging into a wider section where he could actually turn his head from side to side. Day 12 brought a crisis. Daniel's ankle had developed a severe infection, the flesh around the break turning black at the edges. He could smell it now, the distinctive sweet rotten odor of dying tissue. He knew what it meant. Gangrene was setting in, and without antibiotics, the infection would spread through his bloodstream. He had days at most before sepsis killed him, assuming dehydration didn't claim him first. He used his knife to drain what pus he could from the wound, gritting his teeth against pain that made his previous suffering seem mild by comparison. He washed the area with condensation water, knowing it was inadequate but having no other option. The fever came that night, shaking him so violently his teeth chattered against each other. The steam vents couldn't warm him enough to stop the chills. He wrapped himself in his torn uniform shirt and pants, creating layers of insulation, but the shaking continued for hours. His mind drifted in and out of consciousness, mixing memories with hallucinations until he couldn't distinguish between them. He saw Maya as a toddler, taking her first steps across their living room floor. He saw Rebecca on their wedding day, standing in a meadow with wildflowers in her hair. He saw his father, dead for 10 years, sitting beside him in the darkness saying, "Not yet, son, not yet." When dawn came, or what Daniel's internal clock told him was dawn, he forced himself to move despite the fever. Staying still meant giving in, and he wasn't ready for that. He dragged himself forward another 10 yards, then 20, following the warmth through passages that sometimes widened into chambers and sometimes narrowed to cracks he barely fit through. His world had shrunk to immediate concerns: the next drop of water, the next warm zone, the next pull forward. Everything else, his career, his hobbies, his plans for the future, had burned away, leaving only the essential drive to survive. He found a chamber where water actually pooled in a depression in the floor, perhaps a cup's worth collected from multiple drip points. He drank it carefully, savoring each swallow, feeling the moisture spread through his dried tissues. The water was cloudy with minerals, but tasted like salvation. He lay beside the pool for hours, collecting drops as they fell, drinking when enough accumulated. His body absorbed the water desperately, his cells swelling with renewed moisture. The fever broke slightly, though he knew the infection was still progressing. By day 14, Daniel had accepted that he might die in the tubes. The acceptance brought a strange peace. He'd fought as hard as anyone could fight. He'd used every skill, every piece of knowledge, every ounce of determination. If it wasn't enough, then it simply wasn't enough. He thought about what Rebecca had told him once after her father died. Death isn't the enemy. Giving up is the enemy. As long as you're fighting, you're winning. He kept fighting, pulling himself forward even when his arms felt like lead, even when the pain from his ankle made him sob into the darkness. He began talking to the stone itself, conducting one-sided conversations with the ancient rock. "You've seen worse than me," he whispered. "You were born in fire and violence. You've watched species come and go, continents shift, oceans rise and fall. I'm just passing through, same as everything else." The stone didn't answer, but somehow the act of speaking made him feel less alone. He narrated his observations like he was giving a tour. "This formation here shows classic Pahoho structure. The lava moved slowly here, had time to develop that ropey texture. Beautiful work, really. 2,000 years old and still perfect." Then he saw light, real light, not the filtered twilight of skylights, but the bright beam of artificial illumination dancing across stone 50 yards ahead. He tried to shout, but his voice was gone, destroyed by days of screaming and dehydration. He scraped his knife against the rock, creating a metallic screech that echoed through the tube. The sound was harsh and unnatural in the underground silence. The light stopped moving, paused for what felt like an eternity. Then it swung toward him, brightening, approaching rapidly. "Daniel? Daniel Voss." A woman's voice, familiar and impossible. Rebecca emerged from the darkness like a dream made solid, with Jack behind her, both wearing proper caving helmets with powerful LED lamps. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, hands reaching for him with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. He tried to speak, to tell her he was sorry, that he'd never meant to worry her, that he'd tried so hard to get back to her and Maya. No words came out, but she understood. She always understood. "I've got you," Rebecca whispered, cradling his head in her lap. "You're going to be okay. We found you. You're going to be okay." Her tears fell on his face, warm and real, washing away the volcanic dust that coated his skin. Jack was already on the radio, calling for backup, describing their location, using the old mining coordinates Rebecca had identified. Daniel could hear the excitement in his voice. "We have him! He's alive! Repeat, Daniel Voss is alive!" Jack radioed for help, while Rebecca wrapped Daniel in thermal blankets from her pack and forced small sips of water between his cracked lips. She'd been right about the geological formations, about the eastern tubes leading to an area where Victorian-era miners had once explored for silver. The old mining maps showed passages that connected to the natural lava tubes, creating a network that modern surveys had missed. Daniel had crawled to within 100 yards of where she and Jack had entered, through an old prospector's tunnel, its entrance hidden by decades of brush growth. The evacuation took 4 hours of careful preparation and coordination. Rescue teams arrived at the surface entry point, lowering specialized equipment through the mining tunnel that Rebecca and Jack had used. They brought a lightweight rescue litter, medical supplies, and additional lighting to illuminate the extraction route. A paramedic rappelled down to stabilize Daniel before they moved him, starting an IV to combat the severe dehydration and administering antibiotics for the infection. "You picked a hell of a place to take a vacation," the paramedic joked gently while checking Daniel's vital signs. His name tag read Wilson, and his hands were steady and professional as he worked. "Pulse is weak but regular. Blood pressure is low. Temperature is 103.4. Let's get him out of here." They carefully transferred Daniel to the litter, securing him with straps and padding the broken ankle with splints. Every movement brought fresh waves of pain, but Daniel stayed conscious through it all, watching Rebecca's face as she held his hand. They moved him slowly through the passages, a team of 6 people working in coordination. In narrow sections, they pushed the litter ahead of them. In wider chambers, they carried it at shoulder height. Rebecca never left his side, squeezing through tight spaces beside the litter, murmuring encouragement. "Almost there. You're doing great. Maya's waiting for you. She's been so brave, Daniel. She organized half the town to help search. She never gave up on you." When they finally emerged into daylight through the mining tunnel entrance, the October sun had never felt so good on Daniel's face. He squinted against the brightness, his eyes struggling to adjust after 2 weeks in perpetual twilight. An ambulance waited 50 yards away across the broken lava field, its lights flashing. News helicopters circled overhead at a respectful distance. Maya was there, held back by rangers, but straining against their gentle restraint, tears streaming down her face. "Dad!" she screamed when she saw him. The rangers released her, and she ran across the volcanic rock, nearly tripping in her haste. She reached the litter as they were loading it into the ambulance, throwing herself across him with a sob. "I knew you were alive. I knew it. I told everyone you were too stubborn to die down there." Daniel managed a smile, his first in 14 days. He lifted his hand, it felt like lifting a boulder, and touched her hair. "Missed your game," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "We'll replay it for you," Maya said, laughing through her tears. "Every single point. But you have to get better first, okay? You have to get better." They transported him to the Idaho Falls Hospital, sirens wailing across the high desert landscape. He'd lost 38 pounds from his already lean frame. His body temperature was dangerously low, despite the fever from infection. Severe dehydration had damaged his kidneys, and the doctors worried about permanent impairment. The ankle would require multiple surgeries to repair, and they weren't certain he'd walk without a limp. But he was alive, conscious, and according to the doctors who examined him in the emergency room, impossibly lucky. The infection in his ankle was the most immediate concern. They started aggressive antibiotic therapy and prepped him for emergency surgery to debride the necrotic tissue. The lead surgeon, Dr. Patricia Foster, examined the damage and shook her head in amazement. "Another day or two, and we'd be looking at amputation," she told Rebecca in the waiting room. Whatever he did down there to keep that wound clean probably saved his leg. The surgery lasted 6 hours. They removed dead tissue, realigned bone fragments, and inserted pins to stabilize the joint. When Daniel woke in recovery, Rebecca was beside him, still wearing her caving gear covered in volcanic dust. "You need to shower," he whispered, his voice slightly stronger after IV fluids. "I need to watch you breathe," she replied, gripping his hand. "I can shower later." "Do." The story made national news within hours. 22 days alone in the lava tubes, surviving on condensation and steam heat. Reporters called it miraculous, camping outside the hospital for updates. The details captured the public imagination. The systematic exploration, the water collection methods, the use of geothermal vents for warmth. Daniel became known as the Steam Vent Ranger, a nickname he privately hated but publicly accepted with grace. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital, undergoing 3 more surgeries on his ankle and receiving treatment for malnutrition and kidney damage. The organ damage would heal with time, the doctors assured him, though he'd need to be careful about hydration for the rest of his life. Maya rarely left his hospital room, sleeping in the chair beside his bed and showing him videos from her volleyball games he'd missed. She'd recorded them all on her phone, and they watched them together, Daniel pointing out good plays, despite knowing nothing about volleyball. Physical therapy started in week 3. Learning to walk again was humbling. Daniel had hiked hundreds of miles through wilderness terrain, and now he struggled to take 10 steps with a walker. The therapist, a former army medic named Jerome, pushed him hard, but fairly. "You survived 2 weeks underground," Jerome said during a particularly frustrating session. "You can handle 20 steps today. Show me what that ranger stubbornness looks like." The psychological impact was harder to measure. Daniel had nightmares about narrow passages and crushing darkness. He woke gasping, convinced he was still underground. The hospital psychologist, Dr. Amanda Chen, he pushed past the discomfort of her name, being on the excluded list because she was good at her job, helped him work through the trauma. "You experienced prolonged isolation and mortal danger," she explained. "Your brain is processing that experience. Give it time." When Daniel finally returned home, he found that the community had rallied around his family. Their freezer was stocked with meals from neighbors. Someone had repaired the fence Daniel had been meaning to fix for months. The high school volleyball team had worn special warm-up shirts at their tournament with Voss Strong printed on the back. Maya showed him photos, pointing out each teammate, telling stories about the games. Her team had won the regional championship, and she credited her father's survival with giving her the mental strength to play through pressure. The wilderness had changed for him. He still loved the volcanic landscape, still felt the pull of the lava fields when he looked at them from his ranch house windows. But he saw them differently now. They were beautiful and merciless, patient and indifferent. They would outlast him by millennia, would still be here when humanity was gone. That perspective was both humbling and comforting. He resumed Light Ranger duties 6 months later, but with new protocols for solo work and improved communication systems. The Park Service had invested in better GPS trackers and emergency beacons after his ordeal, equipment that might have prevented the entire crisis. Daniel gave talks at ranger stations across the region, emphasizing that survival wasn't about superhuman strength. It was about knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to use what the environment provided. "The vents saved my life," he told audiences, "not because they were powerful, but because I understood what they were and how to use them." Rebecca went back to geology with renewed focus, publishing a paper on the intersection of natural lava tubes and historical mining operations in the craters of the Moon region. Her research led to new mapping projects that would make future rescues easier, faster, safer. She coordinated with the Park Service to create detailed 3-dimensional maps of the tube networks, using ground-penetrating radar and historical survey data. The work was painstaking but important. She never told Daniel that she'd dreamed of the eastern tubes 3 nights running before convincing Jack to explore them. Some things were too strange to explain, even to someone who'd survived the impossible. On the anniversary of his rescue, Daniel returned to the wilderness with his family. They hiked to the approximate location of his fall, marked now by a small memorial cairn that other rangers had built. The cairn stood 4 feet tall, carefully constructed from volcanic rock, with a bronze plaque that read, "In recognition of the human spirit's resilience and the power of knowledge, love and determination." October 2024. Maya placed her father's original ranger badge on top, the same one he'd left as a marker in the darkness. It gleamed in the October sun, bright against the black stone. Daniel stood there for a long time, feeling the heat rising from the lava fields, remembering the cold darkness and the hiss of steam that had kept him alive. He thought about all the small decisions that had saved him, moving east instead of west, trusting the vents, maintaining his routine, refusing to give in to despair. Any one of them could have failed. The line between living and dying had been measured in drops of water and degrees of warmth, in the space between determination and surrender. "Do you ever think about going back down there?" Maya asked, following his gaze toward the invisible network below their feet. She was taller now, almost as tall as her mother, her face showing the first hints of the woman she'd become. Daniel considered the question seriously. Part of him wanted to say yes, to prove he wasn't afraid, to reclaim the space that had nearly killed him. But he knew better. The tubes had taught him everything they had to offer. They'd shown him the edge of human endurance and the thin margin of survival. They'd revealed what mattered most, not the wilderness he'd devoted his life to protecting, but the people waiting for him to come home. "No," he said finally. "I know what's down there now. I know what it costs." He put his arm around Maya's shoulders, pulling her close. "The tubes are incredible, and they're important to understand. But I've learned enough from them. My job now is to teach others what I know, to help them avoid making the choices that put me down there in the first place." They walked back to the truck together, leaving the stone to its eternal silence. Behind them, steam vented from cracks in the earth, warming the air in patterns invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 22 days learning to read the language of heat and stone. The wilderness kept its secrets, but Daniel had survived to tell his own story, not of miracle or magic, but of geology, determination, and the simple truth that sometimes survival is measured not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient accumulation of drops. Rebecca drove them home slowly, taking the long route past the visitors' center where Daniel had worked for 15 years. The center was closed for the season, but Daniel could see his name on the directory board through the window. Daniel Voss, Senior Ranger, Geological Education. It was a title he'd earned through years of study and dedication, and it had saved his life. Knowledge had been his most valuable tool in the darkness. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Daniel and Rebecca sat on their porch watching the stars emerge over the lava fields. The October air was cool, but not cold, carrying the scent of sage from the high desert. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling in patterns as old as the stone itself. "What was the worst moment?" Rebecca asked quietly. It was the first time she'd asked directly, and Daniel knew she'd been waiting for him to be ready to answer. He thought about it carefully. Not the fall, not the hunger or the thirst. The worst moment was when I realized I might not make it back to you and Maya. When I understood that all my knowledge and all my effort might not be enough. That was the moment I almost gave up. What changed? I remembered what you told me after your father died, that fighting is winning, even if you don't survive. I decided that if I was going to die down there, I'd die moving forward, not lying still. Every pull forward was a victory, even if it was the last thing I ever did. Rebecca leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. You pulled yourself 200 yards on a broken ankle. The doctors still can't believe it. 240 yards, Daniel corrected with a slight smile. I counted. I wanted to know exactly how far I'd come when they found me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, bright and clear in the high desert darkness. Somewhere out there, light years away, stars were being born in clouds of gas and dust. Somewhere else, they were dying in spectacular explosions. The universe was vast beyond comprehension, and human life was briefer than a spark. But that spark mattered. Daniel had learned that in the darkness. I love you, Rebecca said simply. I know, Daniel replied, pulling her closer. That's what brought me back. Not the vents or the water or the knowledge. It was knowing that you and Maya were up here, waiting, believing I'd find a way. That's what kept me pulling forward when my body wanted to quit. Inside the house, they could hear Maya talking on the phone with friends, her voice animated and happy. The sound was ordinary and precious. Daniel closed his eyes and listened, memorizing the moment. He'd survived the impossible, and every moment afterward was a gift. He intended to treat it that way, to live with the awareness that life was fragile and precious and worth fighting for, one pull at a time, one drop at a time, one breath at a time, until there were no more breaths to take. The lava fields stretched dark and silent under the stars, holding their secrets close. The steam still rose from hidden vents, warming the October night. The stone still told its ancient stories to anyone patient enough to read them. And Daniel Voss, the ranger who'd survived 22 days in the darkness, sat on his porch with his wife and listened to his daughter laugh, knowing he'd finally found his way home.